going to talk about a topic that's been of great interest to many of you, and a couple of other speakers have touched on it, but we're going to hone in now on this idea of public pensions and the public workforce, how they're doing and what is the future. Dr. Joshua Franzel is here. He's the Vice President of Research at the Center for State and Local Government Excellence. He leads research on a number of issues. He has worked for both the Delaware and Florida legislatures and International Trade Administration and OMB. His research focuses on state and local government management, public finance, pensions, and other issues of interest. And has a PhD from our own American University.
Yeah.
So terrific. Thank you for being here. We look forward to it.
Well, thanks. Well, good afternoon. I know that I'm the last person of the day, so you guys are probably pretty fatigued at this point. But I wanted to sort of take some time with you this afternoon to talk about a topic that's received a little bit of attention over the past few years, state and local pensions, but then also cover briefly some issues we're seeing also in terms of retiree health care. And so just to give you a little bit of background, and first let me say I apologize for not wearing my jacket. It's a bit toasty in here, so. So our center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research group that's based here in Washington, with the main mission to promote excellence in state and local governments so that they earn a position to attract and retain employees. All of our work is freely available via our website, slge.org. And actually, before I get started, I asked that our new report that we released today, it's our annual survey of state and local workforce human resource directors from around the country. We do this with the International Public Management Association for Human Resources and the National Association of State Personnel Executives. And it's some pretty interesting findings in that. And then also I included a one-pager of sort of some of the recent research we've released over the past year or so. So if you were to look at our center, basically, and we cover a lot of different issues, but they basically fall into one of these 7 buckets: retirement, benefits and security, which I'll talk with you today about; healthcare, both for active employees and then retirees; compensation; human resource trends and workforce demographics; and then competitive employment practices and financial planning. Actually, I sat in on the last portion of the previous speaker, and sort of some of the comments that were mentioned about financial education I'd like to touch on at the end of my presentation. So what do we know about the state and local government pension sector? Well, there are about 3,400 state and local government employment retirement systems around the country, and this could range from something like CalPERS, a very large pension plan, all the way down to a pension plan in somewhere in Pennsylvania that covers 100 employees. So it's a rather wide range of things, and typically, and as of 2011, about 14.6 million active members were participating in these systems, with about 8.6 million retirees. Now, as you probably figure, the majority of state and local workers continue to have access to a defined benefit traditional pension plan, with about 32% having access to some form of defined contribution plan. Now, just as an aside, I think probably the 32% is a little bit low, just because there are some states that I'll talk about in a minute that offer it as a primary defined contribution plan, but a lot of other states and localities offer it as a supplemental plan. And I think if you were to step back and look to see the combination of both employees that have access to a defined contribution primary plan and defined contribution plan, it probably would be a bit higher than 32%. And it's important to note, and I'm sure that by covering these issues in the individual states, about 30% of state and local workers don't participate in Social Security. And there are portions in every state in virtually every state that this is the case, but typically there are 6 to 8 states where a large portion of these workers are not covered by Social Security. So I wanted to sort of, in setting the context, talk about what the different structures are in terms of providing retirement benefits across the state. So now this data is as of middle to late 2012. But as all the states in blue offer some form of defined benefit traditional pension plan. Those in gray offer a primary defined contribution plan for state workers, and these are state employees, not necessarily locals or education, but general state employees. The states in goldish yellow, offer a choice between plans, be it defined benefit or defined contribution, or hybrid or defined contribution, or hybrid and defined benefit, and we'll talk about that. And then those in white offer some form of hybrid plan, where there's a either side-by-side or side-by-side defined benefit, smaller defined benefit with defined contribution, or on top of one another, where there's a defined benefit and then there's a variable defined contribution that's on top. So one of the reasons why pensions, among other reasons, are getting a lot of attention is because of the sort of the changing costs that states and localities are having to deal with regarding a lot of these benefits. This data is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and what it shows is this is as a portion of the employer cost for employee compensation. In 2004, wages made up about 69% of the employer cost for employee compensation for state and local workers. Fast forward a decade, that percentage is down to 65%. Where some of this difference has been made up is health insurance has gone from 10% of overall employer cost for employee compensation up to 12%, and defined benefit retirements have gone from 6% to 8%. Just adding sort of a couple more pieces to the puzzle here. When you look at overall the contributions that states and localities are required to pay to maintain their pensions, we're seeing typically called the ARC, the annual required contribution, which is the employer's cost for the wages that are the benefit that's earned for that individual year, plus some amortized portion of any unfunded liability attached to the pension plan, and then possibly an employee contribution as well, and that's referred to as the annual required contribution. We're seeing annual required contributions over the past decade increase by 13% annually. So we're seeing while wages are either flat, and their portion they're making up of overall compensation is decreasing, we're seeing employer costs, and as I'll talk about in a little bit, employee costs raising to support these benefits. Now let me stop right there and say, feel free to jump in as I'm talking through this. I enjoy having conversations, and so if you have any questions, stop me, or comments, stop me. Yeah.
Something I've always wanted to clarify.
Mhm.
If a government does not participate in Social Security
Mhm.
for its employees, is it possible for an employee who wants to make the entire contribution themselves and just participate sort of independently? Like, if, maybe they've had a previous career where they've got a Social Security thing going and they want to get those last few years in or whatever. Can they do it themselves without their employer?
I have not heard of as a non-Social Security, I'm not a Social Security lawyer, so I don't necessarily know. I've not heard of that situation happening. That said, they're very well to your point. There are situations where you have a public worker that maybe worked in the private sector for 20 years, is eligible for Social Security through that employment experience, and then goes and works for the local county on the back end of their career, and the county happens not to participate in Social Security. So they're still eligible for Social Security benefits based on their previous work experience.
Right.
So I wanted to talk a bit about the funded ratio, which is of these state and local plans, which is the portion, the assets held in trust, makeup of liabilities or those the promised benefits for providing retirement benefits to state and local workers out into the future. And just as a resource, if any of you are interested, if you go to our website, our center, along with the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College, maintains the public plans database, which tracks about 85% of all public pension plan assets and members, and it's about 120, 130 plans And what we're doing right now is expanding it to include more local governments and have a larger number of plans and variables. And so we're actually in the process of expanding it. So a lot of the data I'm about to sort of talk about comes from that, and it allows us sort of to track public plan financials over time. So as you can see, in 2003, in the aggregate, the average funder ratio for public pension plans, and this is state and local, was about 88%. So 88 for every dollar in liabilities that were in retirement promises that were offered by public employers to their employees. States and localities had 88 cents in trust to pay for those assets or those liabilities. Fast forward to about 2007, this average funder ratio for these plans was about 85%, and as of 2012, the last year we have pretty much complete information for all these plans that we track. It was about 71%. And I was pulling the numbers the other day that we have so far for 2013, and it looks to be right around 71% in 2013.
So that begs the question then, your 13% annual increase in ARC
Mm-hmm.
in the required expenses, is that what they're required to pay, or is that what they actually pay? Did they
Well,
actually
yeah,
pay
that's a good point. I will get to that in a minute, because just because they're required to pay an annual required contribution doesn't necessarily mean they
Right.
do pay the full amount, which has led
Right.
to some problems, in funding problems for certain plans, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So not everyone's in the same boat. I mean, when I often enjoy sort of reading some of the trade and mainstream media, and it's sort of a lot of folks want to paint this broad brush by saying everyone's in a sinking ship when it comes to these plans, and it's not necessarily the case. As you can see, there's a distribution of these plans. Again, these are the 126 public plans that we track, along with our partners at Boston College. And as you can see, about 45% of all these plans have funder ratios somewhere in the 60 to 79% range, with others doing quite well, and some not so much. And just to add some context, I know where some of you are from, but some plans we have on this end of the spectrum are Wisconsin, Denver, New York, some of the New York plans. On this end, you have plans in Kentucky, most of the plans in Illinois, and then most are somewhere in between. And I do want to talk about Illinois gets a lot of coverage around this topic, but I do want to talk about in a few minutes one of the Illinois plans that fits into the right-hand side of this distribution, and highlight why that is, and speaks to your paying your full ARC comment. So why are some plans better funded than others? Well, they consistently fund their annual required contribution. Now, even as the annual required contribution has fluctuated over the years, many of the plans have gone that we've studied that are on solid footing financially have year in year out paid their annual required contribution. And as an example, the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund covers most local governments in Illinois. Is anyone from Illinois here? Okay. So are you familiar with the Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund? The Illinois Municipal Retirement Fund is a statewide plan that covers local government, covers local governments and provides assets to cover their pension promises. It does not cover Chicago, but one of the reasons why it's in the position it's in, and I think, let me see, it's currently, it's 84% funded. And one of the reasons that is because it's in a position where it's able to require the local governments that participate to pay their full ARC year in, year out. What are some other reasons why these plans are funded? The plans that are, they have appropriate full retirement ages. Now, I'm not here to tell you there's a magic number for appropriate full retirement age. It really does depend on sort of the roles that are filled in the public workforce. But certainly those that are in a better position are more conservative or typically have a skew older in terms of their retirement ages relative to their peers and the type of work that's being completed. So a public safety officer is on average is going to be able to retire sooner than a public works. But relatively speaking, they have more conservative, longer working lives expected to vest fully in a pension plan. Let me stop right there and see if there are any comments or questions.
Yeah, at what percent funded does a pension plan become, considered on solid footing as opposed to underfunded?
Oh, there isn't any one benchmark. There have been some entities like GAO that sort of uses 80% as a threshold, but I don't even think that that's their official threshold. They refer to 80% in some of their reports. I think you're not off base if you consider 80% as sort of like the you're doing okay if you're above it sort of thing.
But doesn't the ARC assume that you're going to hit some threshold, or try to get you to some threshold or something?
Yeah, well, ARC is based towards full funding, 100% full funding. But there are, for a whole host of other reasons, you might not hit, and we'll talk about in a minute in terms of the assumptions that are used, and you might not hit 100% just by paying your ARC based on market fluctuations for where these assets are invested and other reasons as well, inflation, things like that.
It's probably an obvious question, but if your pension plan is 80% funded, does that mean the retirees get 80% of what?
No, the retirees, assuming everything else is constant, i.e. like no reforms are made, the retirees will get what they're promised via the benefit multiplier, which would be a equation of some number 1.5, 2.0 times an average of their final high 3 or high 5 years. They're promised they're going to get what they're promised, but it's on the government side, the sponsoring government side, to make up that difference somehow.
Is there a percentage level below which it would impact the retirement?
Well, I mean, there are some plans that have sort of that have some safeguards against that, but the majority of them, it would be up to the sponsoring government to make up that difference. But that's not to say that everything is static. It very well could be that once you dip, if you're below, and we'll talk about the recent pension reforms in a minute, if you're below a certain amount, that incentivizes the state legislature, the sponsoring government, the state legislature, or city council to make reforms.
What amount is that generally?
Well, as we'll see in a minute, there have been the vast majority of states have implemented reforms, and not everyone's in a bad boat. So there isn't necessarily a magic number where you go below, and it sort of incentivizes people to make changes. I mean, Wisconsin's a great example. I mean, Wisconsin is 98% funded, but there, as we all know, there was a lot of action in Wisconsin 2 or 3 years ago,
right,
around that. So. And conversely, while Illinois has been trying to push through a lot of reforms, they've been having some challenges in terms of getting reforms done there, but they're extremely low funded, poorly funded. So I don't think there is necessarily a threshold that drives reform or not. Another reason why some plans are better funded, and let me just make a side note here. This list comes from when our center and then other groups like the Government Finance Officers Association and others, we go out and we sort of look at the plans that are more well-funded and sort of look at what they're doing management-wise, what they're doing funded-wise, what they're doing in terms of the structure of the benefit, and sort of we've noticed these themes coming out of several really well-funded plans. And actually, we've done a series of case studies, most recently looking at what's been done in Delaware, what's been done in Denver, and we do state and local, Illinois municipal retirement, and the other one's escaping me right now. But with those and then others, you really begin to see these sort of surface to the top as the reasons that sort of why some plans are better off than others at this point. So the third point I wanted to raise is they're realistic about the assumptions they use. There's a lot of conversation around the rate of return assumption that a lot of these plans use. The conversation being, are these plans selecting rates of return that appropriately match what they can expect to achieve in the market? Pension plans' assets are typically invested in traditional equities, guaranteed, private equity. It depends what the sponsoring government typically will allow them to invest in, but real estate, cash, and so there's a wide range of investment vehicles that they're able to invest in, should their sponsoring government allow them to. And the conversation around assumptions has been very much around, are these plans assuming the appropriate rates of return that are going to match realistically what they can realistically achieve for the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years. But usually the conversation stops there when it comes to assumptions. But I often like to bring up the fact that also these plans, are they accurately making the right assumptions around inflation? We've been in very low inflationary periods over the past, especially since the economic downturn. But a lot of these plans are still assuming inflation that's much higher than reality. Life expectancy. Some plans are still using mortality tables from the 1970s and 1980s, and that doesn't necessarily match the life expectancy that many of us hope to achieve, going forward. And there are a whole host of other assumptions. So while a lot of, many of you probably covered this in your articles, while there's a lot of conversation around the investment return assumptions, there are a whole host of other assumptions that should be paid attention to as well. And the accuracy of those is key for how well the position the plan is going forward. And just sort of attached to that, we've seen, a lot of those the experts that end up picking the assumptions for these plans have been attached to the plan in some form for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And we've often found that plans that sort of question the assumptions in a healthy way, bring in external experts to see whether or not the assumptions that are being used actually make sense, sort of the checking, if you will. Those plans are often in a better position than those that sort of just go with the status quo assumption that has been used since anyone can remember. A couple other key reasons why these plans are more well-funded than others. They don't allow extraordinary income to be included in pension formulas. The compensation related to a car or a cell phone or overtime and things like this. A lot of these, a lot of the plans that are in better shape, base it more or less solely on the base compensation as opposed to any other external, internal but extra compensation. And then also several of the plans that are in decent shape in 2014 also take a long-term view where they don't take holidays. With the tech boom in the early 2000s or 2005, 2006 time frame, when a lot of these plans didn't pay their full arc because they were well surpassing their expectations for the market performance, and so some of them either didn't contribute as much as they otherwise should have contributed. So not taking contribution holidays and avoiding retroactive benefit increases that haven't been planned for in by your actuaries and other professionals that sort of model how much you need to pay in the form of annual required contributions to pay for benefits going forward. That's been set, but when you change how much is being offered as a benefit, that impacts the calculations all the way through, and it could really impact your funding levels going forward. So let me stop there and see if anyone has any comments, disagrees with me, or. I teach a class at American here and at American University here, and it's I often take one class to talk about the importance of employee benefits and sort of their fiscal impact on states and localities. And the first time I did it, I've been doing it for several years now. The first time I did it, I wasn't quite sure how the students would react to it. Like, you know, eyes rolled in the back of their heads. But a lot of these folks, which are, you know, in their early 20s to late 20s typically, they're very interested in this because I think it's very clear to see how this impacts them if they're a public employee, but quite frankly, just as taxpayers to see, you know, going forward how it's going to impact them. Yeah.
I just kind of want to say here because I've been covering this for a long time, and editors and readers' eyes glaze over, particularly mostly editors, not readers so much. But there are ways to sex it up. For example, we have an unfunded county plan that their rate of return assumption is 7.5%, and Moody's thinks it should be more like 5.5%. The difference between 5.5 and 7.5 is billions of dollars. It more than doubles the unfunded liability of that plan. If they went to a respectable, and you know, Robert Shiller's data, Warren Buffett, everybody says that if you think you're going to do better than 6% a year over the next 10 years, you're nuts. And that applies to individual savers. And the other thing is lifespan. CalPERS just got caught gilding a lily on its lifespan assumptions. It was using one of these old everybody's going to die early kind of things, and it was using that to obscure its underfunded condition. And the way I like to turn on the light bulb with people is to say, we all love to read these New York Times stories about the latest cure for cancer and biotech innovations. Well, if some San Diego biotech cures Alzheimer's and cures cancer, every pension system on the planet is grievously bankrupt. They won't be able to keep any of their promises. They're all broke instantly. So, you know, CalPERS, I think, was off by just a couple years. I forget, maybe you know, but
I'm not familiar with it.
yeah, well, they were using 72 instead of 74.5 or something like that, and it was billions of dollars. So, I don't know. These the lever is really long, and the fulcrum is way over here on these things. And it's easy to say, oh gosh, 7%, 1%. What are they fighting about? Well, they're absolutely huge.
And actually, to your point, with the way you know, you see a lot of these assumptions covered, especially with the investment return assumption, it's often viewed as they're static. But in reality, we've seen, especially in the wake of 2008, 2009, a lot of these plans begin to become more conservative with their investment assumptions. I'm not here to say I know the perfect investment assumption, because I don't. But it was, I think, right after we were coming out of 2008, 2009, the average was around 8% of the rate of return assumptions being used. Now it's somewhere in the mid 7s. So, you know, I guess you could argue you should go further. One could argue that you should go further, but there has been a sort of recalibration, if you will, as we've gotten farther away from the recent.
There's a whole other level of discussion around assumptions, which is really, why are the assumptions being made the way they're made?
That's what I was going to ask, actually.
Having participated in those discussions for a corporate pension plan, and having, sins of a previous life, worked at a state legislature where all those discussions were taking place, a lot of it has to do with driving what that arc is, so that you can appear to look like you're being fiduciary responsible by fully funding or, you know, giving it up, but it doesn't bust your budget, and you'll let the next session of the legislature worry about it. And that's I think what drives a lot of
Sure, it's to keep the contributions low.
the required contributions. So it looks like you're doing good.
I will say, to your point, I have been very impressed with certain states that have gone back and looked to see how accurate they've been with their assumptions relative to the realities, relative to what they've assumed. And a large number have been. I mean, there's been a lot of coverage of the investment assumptions and what's used. Many have been quite accurate with what they've achieved over a 25 or 30 year time frame. What really threw a wrench into a lot of these assumptions and sort of projections has been 2008 and sort of I guess as an aside, most of these plans don't accept their losses in 1 year. They'll smooth it out over 3 to 5 years, and so Any losses that were realized in 2008, 2009 were still being phased in for a lot of these plans in 2011, 2012, and so on. And
CalPERS is doing 20-year smooth, just to make it nice,
Huh.
because we don't want to.
So, related to the survey report that I handed out today, this has been a series over a number of years. And what we do is our center goes and along with our two other partners, the International Public Management Association for Human Resources and the National Association of State Personnel Executives, we ask a whole host of questions about workforce changes they're making, compensation benefits, compensation and benefits, and other changes they're making. And one question that I thought was really relevant to our conversation today was, over the past year, has your government made any changes to the retirement benefits you offer to your employees? And as you can see, since 2009, there's been an increase, and these are state and local governments. Just reinforcing this, when the National Conference of State Legislatures looks at the 50 states, I believe their number is, since 2009, 48 of the 50 states have made some major reform to their pension benefits. So what are these changes? Well, when we go out and we sort of map, again, this is our center along with the National Association of State Retirement Administrators and NCSL. When we map what some of these changes are, let me pause real quick so you guys can digest this. So I just am not reading it all here, but
Are these available on your site, these slides?
I'm happy to send it.
They'll be
all the
Oh,
slides,
okay,
right?
right, okay.
But we have in some other form this information up there. So as you can see, I don't want to talk over your thinking here. Oh, so as you can see, for current workers, increasing their contributions, reducing their benefits, increasing eligibility requirements, reducing cost of living adjustments have been quite popular. These are the number of states. For new employees, reduction in benefits, increasing vesting periods, essentially across the board, this is translating into a reduced benefit going forward. And then for retirees, the action has really been in reducing the COLA, as probably many of your states have done, implemented. So before I transition to the topic of retiree healthcare, I wanted to stop right there to see if there any thoughts. Yeah.
I'm from Detroit, so anything you want to say about Detroit, feel free. As you go through this, I don't want to get following your head, but on the increased vesting, one of the things I wondered, the vesting period, someone told us the other day is 5 years. That's by ERISA as of 1986. That was what we were told. Is that what that is?
Well, vesting periods range across these. Some it's 5, some it's 7, some it's 10.
Can you have 7 or more?
Yeah. There's some plans that have 10-year vesting periods.
But doesn't that go against ERISA?
No, ERISA doesn't apply to
Doesn't
state.
apply.
Doesn't apply to state and local pensions.
Okay,
Yeah.
this is something I should know.
And actually, your point on the vesting more broadly, I think it's important. A lot of people view vesting as impacting young workers the most, and in terms of if I'm a 22-year-old teacher and I start my work, and turns out I really don't like teaching all that much, and I leave after 5 years. I've pretty much lost everything that I've earned in retirement benefits because I haven't been at a point where I invested. And most people sort of stop there with that conversation. I think it's also important, especially I believe the previous speaker talked about baby boomers. If I'm a baby boomer that's worked in corporate America for 20 years, and now I work for or 30 years, and now I work when I work for the state. That same 10-year vesting requirement also is an impediment to me too, because I won't necessarily be incentivized to go work for the state if I know that I'm not going to work for 10 years. So there's oftentimes the conversation focuses on the younger cohorts in the workforce, but I think it impacts sort of on both ends of the spectrum.
So you have an opinion on vesting there? Do you think 5 is too early?
Our center doesn't make recommendations in terms of what the right investment assumption is, what the right investing requirements are. We sort of highlight sort of what these decisions matter, and it's up to, and quite frankly, the sponsoring government, if they want to choose, if they feel the terms that they've adopted match the human resource, the recruitment, retention, and retirement human resource imperatives that they want to meet, or I'm missing a word there, but if it meets their objectives, then so be it. If they're paying their ARC based on using these assumptions and they have a healthy plan, more power to them. I don't really think that that there is any one golden number.
Does the increased eligibility requirements speak to retirement age, or is it making a reasonable retirement age?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
These changes, do you think that's in response to the voter revolt against public pensions and trying to take action before voters or the courts take a more drastic action? Or is this kind of looking at the economy and saying we've got to make changes? What role is the voter revolt playing in these
I
changes?
think that certainly the backdrop of the impact that the 2008-2009 losses had on these plans, amongst that backdrop, that was the main driver, without a doubt, in driving forward a lot of these changes. But one thing to note with a lot of these changes is that, if I should have also put the National Conference of State Legislature map up there that shows all 48 states, but primarily these changes are being made within the traditional defined benefit structure, and with exception, there are some where they've converted over to a hybrid plan or to a defined contribution plan, but primarily, especially at the state level, and mostly and also somewhat at the local level, these changes are being made within these traditional structures.
Back to the vesting, in California, teachers vested right away, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
I know 2-year teachers that have 2 years worth of
Mm-hmm.
CalSTRS for the rest of their lives, and I always assumed that it was because the teachers union is so politically powerful there that they wanted it, but we also have problems getting qualified teachers into LA and inner city schools.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have problems with recruiting and retention, I would think the employers would want really quick vesting, so that you didn't have the problem you just described. So have you studied whether there's a correlation between, worker shortages equal shorter vesting periods versus states that have plenty of workers to choose from, or powerful unions versus not?
So I don't know. We don't have information looking at that relationship, but I will say on sort of a qualitative side, we've looked at, especially if you step back and you look at teachers, and especially with some of the current thinking, where a teacher is most effective after they've been on the job for 8 or 10 years, and then I guess there's like an effectiveness premium, and then it sort of levels, and then maybe tails off a little bit. It's in the sponsoring government's best interest to capture those people to get their years of highest productivity, and similarly, and so that's one rationale for sort of the vesting requirements. Maybe in your case where you have a short investing period, so that they're now bought into the system, the retirement system, and it's in their best interest to stay. Another employee group that they use vesting requirements to hold on to them is public safety. If you think of a young police officer, he's brought in, he has to go through the academy, the police academy, have other types of specialized training. That's a lot of an initial investment on the government side in the front end. So to incentivize that, keep that person to stay, it's in their best interest to have that person be eligible for retirement benefits sooner rather than later, so that they can hold on to that person to be able to have the return on investment for training. Those are just two examples to your point.
I'm not sure I follow the logic of that. If I wanted to retain people, I would think I'd want to push the vesting out so that they would have to stay with the organization for a longer time until they're vested.
Well,
Having a shorter vesting,
yeah.
you come, you punch your ticket, and you're out.
Well, there's also once you're eligible to receive the benefits, then you're in a position now to accrue the benefits and increase and accrue. And so,
but there's less of a cost of change for you if you decide to go do something.
Yeah, but I'm not going to come in the first place if I'm chained to that place for 10 years
Yeah.
to get any of my retirement.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
It's a big deterrent to hiring.
But recruitment's different than retention.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying that
No, I
whether
understand.
the shorter vesting periods versus longer, but these actually are baked into human resource issues as well. Was there another question? No. Okay. So now let's talk about retiree healthcare. So our center, we're updating the data now. What we do is we go out, and I'll explain this chart in a second. What we do is we go out and collect retiree healthcare data, so liability data, for all 50 states. We've been doing this in 3 or 4 iterations at this point, since 2008, 2009. And that allows us to track, essentially the liabilities that are attached to these states for general employees in terms of the unfunded accrued actuarial liability. Unlike pensions, where you have all states have some form of trust setting aside money to pre-fund the benefit down the road, about half, less than half, of states have begun setting money aside to cover the retiree healthcare liabilities. Now, one could argue, especially in certain environments, it's a lot easier to change retiree healthcare liabilities than it is to change pension benefits, so it has to be viewed in sort of a different light, and I could talk about that in a minute. But these essentially, as of when a colleague and I gathered the data in 2013, these are the liabilities in billions for all 50 states. Now, there are some exceptions, like Nebraska and Oklahoma, I believe. Nebraska doesn't report any unfunded liability because they don't feel it's material, because they don't offer retiree health care, and the type of retiree health care they offer does not accrue liabilities in terms of there's not a state subsidy attached to it. And stop me if I'm confusing things. But as you can see here, in total, it's about 425 billion in aggregate. 425 billion in aggregate unfunded liabilities for retiree healthcare for all 50 states for their general employees. This does not include teachers or other segments like judges, other plans that cover other types of workers. These are for general employees. But
But would the number be a lot bigger if it did?
the number would be bigger if it did. Yeah.
Public safety.
And but about 80% of all the liabilities are owned by about 12 states. So it's not a just like pensions. States are in different positions in terms of their liabilities. And I often I included in your packets. There's a retiree healthcare brief that we released in 2013. And another way that we like cutting these numbers up to sort of standardize things is looking at the unfunded liabilities attached to the retiree health by per capita. And so a state like Hawaii has a per capita unfunded liability of about $8,400 relative to a state like North Dakota, $77 per capita. So you have wide variation. I don't know if it's are the briefs in their packets or
What's it look like?
it,
The ones that you just handed out?
no, the ones that I sent a link a few weeks ago.
I think we just sent them links.
Okay.
I think we got it.
Okay. Well, when you're back, if you have trouble sleeping later, in your email, it's called Retiree Healthcare Benefits for State Employees in 2013. It's a very original name. And so you have much like a very wide variation in terms of the overall liabilities, but also the per capita liabilities.
How much thinking do you think is going on in this, that this is going to be dumped onto the federal government?
There certainly are, people are wondering how, especially if you're a pre-65 retiree, not yet eligible for Medicare, how will this affect the exchanges that are currently being stood up? I think the jury's still out. I personally think the jury's still out on that. I don't think that, I don't have enough information right now to sort of answer that. But I will say, in reaction to a lot of these liabilities, states are making changes. We've seen since 2002, this is the percentage of state government units offering insurance to retirees. And what this is the blue line is for retirees under the age of 65, and the yellow line is for retirees over the age of 65. And so you're seeing is state government units that are less of them now are offering these benefits. On top of that, what we're seeing as some of the most common changes, and sort of back to my comment about how pension benefits and healthcare benefits are different. Whereas a pension benefit, assuming everything stays consistent and constant, the equation that's used to determine the benefits is the equation, as opposed to, as we all know with our own healthcare, premiums, co-payments, and others fluctuate on a fairly regular basis. So there's always going to be fluctuation in how much an employee pays or retiree pays relative to how much their sponsoring employer pays, right? And so, sort of with that lens, if you look at some of the more common changes, one of the ways that states are trying to reduce their retiree healthcare costs are increasing premiums and deductibles for both retirees, their dependents, and I should have put in there for active employees as well, increasing co-payments. They're also increasing the age of eligibility or years of service required to vest in retiree healthcare. It goes back to sort of a similar conversation that we talked about earlier with pensions. Increasing the cap on the retiree's out-of-pocket expenses. And on a good side, when we go out and collect this data, we often keep track of whether or not a state's reporting that they've begun setting money aside to cover retiree healthcare liabilities. Now, there are some states that have done this for a while. Alaska is one, Ohio is another. But when we did a wave of data collection back in 2009, 2011, 18 states reported that they had begun pre-funding. That doesn't mean they're setting the full amount aside to cover their full liability. They're at least putting some money aside into a trust that would generate revenue in terms of investments that then would be used to cover retired healthcare down the road. So 18 states in 2009 to 2011. Fast forward a year and a half, 25 states were reporting that they had begun to set money aside. Again, not necessarily to cover the full liability, but at least they had begun to establish a trust or other type of mechanism to begin to set money aside. So there is some good news on with this topic. Now, some of the other changes that states are making, and this still is like a much smaller portion than the previous slide. Some states are interested more in wellness programs and variety, chronic care management, and implementing some form of defined contribution model for healthcare, like a health savings plan, like a high deductible plan coupled with a health savings plan, for instance, some form of defined contribution model.
Josh?
Yeah.
Is there any research or evidence around the effectiveness of those wellness plans in terms of reducing costs over time?
I'm glad you brought that up. We've released a brief probably about a year ago called the Business Case for Wellness Programs, and I don't have the data off the top of my head, but there has been. I'm happy to send that to you to send to the group. Essentially, it goes and looks at sort of some of the literature and research that's been done on the private side, and some of the research that's been done, especially on the public state side, and it looks at sort of what components of wellness programs have been at least shown or thought to reduce healthcare costs going forward. I'm sorry I didn't bring that with me, but I'm happy to send that out.
That's okay. Yeah, I would love to see it.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like if they have found things that really work,
Mm-hmm.
it'd be a huge story in terms of overall public health.
Yeah. So, before we have a small conversation. I know you guys are headed out to the Press Club restaurant or bar, but I wanted sort of to leave a few points just to get to make you think a little bit in terms of what are some of the challenges, but also opportunities in 2014 and beyond. And so, like, you know, we've talked about public employer costs and contributions, how they'll be handled both on the front end in terms of how the employers are going to be making changes to affect their annual required contributions, but also on the employee side. In an environment where we've seen several years of stagnant wages, how the employees will be able to deal with increased costs, especially on the healthcare side, and as we saw on the pension side, on their having contribution increase for them as well. Retiree healthcare and assets. I would keep your eye on the states. Your states, if they don't have a healthcare trust already, are they going to establish one? How's it going to be managed? There are a lot of these similar questions for pension trusts. What assumptions are being used? And with that, it would be also on healthcare assumptions. What healthcare assumptions are being used? What the mortality tables that are being used? A lot of the same topics that we talked about with pensions. As states at least try to begin to set money aside to cover these retiree healthcare benefits, how are these trusts structured? Also, the role of supplemental retirement plans. So, if you think of a lot of these pension changes, translates into a reduced benefit. How are these public employees going to make up the difference, especially if they don't have access to Social Security? And so we really view the role of supplemental retirement plans as increasing going forward. Many states already offer it, but many times participation is low. So is the role going to become greater? And how will they be managed? And how will people be incentivized to participate given the backdrop of continued pension reform? As of right, a group we work with recently told me that I think that the defined contribution supplemental sector is now over $1 trillion in assets. And when you think of, I used to know, $4 trillion for pension assets, somewhere around there. And that's not a small potatoes relative to pension assets. So I think you're going to see an increased importance in supplemental retirement savings for the public sector, and then also employee financial education. So if you consider defined benefit pension plans to be very paternalistic, and then you see a reduction in these benefits going forward, and folks are now responsible more for making up the difference on their own, the role of financial education. And we often talk about it in terms of governments really need to have an honest conversation with themselves in terms of what the scope of the education programs are. Does it cover just the benefits and wages that are offered by the public employer, or does it cover the wide range of vehicles that are available to that public employee? Also, the relevance in terms of a retiree that's going to retire 5 years from now very well might be in a different place, or today, quite frankly, in a different place than a retiree from 20 years ago. They might still have mortgage debt. They might still have kids living at home with them. They might not have saved enough in previous places of employment, and so the mix of financial challenges might be different than their peers 20 years prior, and so these financial education programs have to account for that. And then also the network effects of financial education that governments offer. So if everyone, most of us know or maybe are related to a state or local worker, if you're able to push out financial education to that core group of folks, the network effects that it impacts on society more broadly we view as important as well. So let me stop there. I know we're 20 minutes before we're done.
If they educate their employees too well financially, they'll just alert them to how acutely badly off they are compared to people 20 years ago. Instead of keeping the dark.
Well, especially to your point, it's especially since the economic downturn, employee groups. There have been a whole host of blogs stood up, and you and your colleagues have covered it well. I think people are a lot more in tune with these situations now than they were in, say, 2005 or 2006. And I think that's a good thing. I think information is a good thing. but your point's very well taken in terms of understanding the assumptions that are being used and whether or not their employer is making the full contribution that they're required to maintain the benefit, things like this.
So what do states like Illinois and cities like Chicago or Detroit, what do they do? I mean, how do they get themselves, first, I really wanna know how they get themselves in the hole, particularly as deeply as they did. I mean, I could see a little financial juggling, but, you know, Illinois is in huge trouble. And then how do they get themselves out? I mean, do they ultimately then put a tax on a tax? Because basically as taxpayers, we're all paying for it to begin with, and now are they all gonna come back and tax us again to fund the underfunded?
I think a good first step, and the step that especially Illinois hasn't followed, is making the required contributions. I mean, and that's.
But if they don't have the money to make the required contributions.
You're right, and that's a broader public finance issue in terms of you're right, the mix of taxes and the reduction in benefit. There has to be a balance. I mean, that's.
Are they banking on a rebound of the economy?
Or are we like looking at the water spilling over the dam like with Detroit and some of the bankrupt California city and waiting for the courts to say we don't have to back up these promises as taxpayers, which feels like where we're heading when I see even rich towns in Marin County saying we need to do a bond issue to repair roads because we're paying so much in our pensions. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of this. Are we just seeing the trickle of the dam that's going to
Well,
burst?
there's certainly some locals that are in positions in states that are in positions where they are going to have to seriously restructure the benefits and continue, and plus contributing their full required contributions to give them a fighting chance of getting back on solid footing. But then also, I think it's also important to always differentiate between a local government that's an entity that's been born out of the creation of a state as opposed to a sovereign entity of a state. That a state can't go bankrupt here, you know, and there are. It's important to know how the pension benefits are governed within an individual state, and the thresholds under which there's a trigger mechanism to force the restructuring of benefits, even given existing employee agreements.
Some states have, like California, for example, has a constitution that says that once a state worker, once any public worker gets a vested benefit, it can't be taken away. So for state workers in California, the state can't go bankrupt and no vested benefit can be taken away. So if you're a state worker, you're covered. But if you're a city or a county worker, you're gravely at risk. They can't take away your benefits, but they can go bankrupt, and a federal bankruptcy judge can take away your benefits.
And you know, it also depends on the state too, because some states don't recognize municipal bankruptcy, others do. Some only recognize it under certain circumstances. So it really depends on the state you're a local government employee in, and then also how the benefits are viewed relative to fiscal distress.
Don't you think that so many of these cities?
I'm sorry, Susan had her hand
Oh, I'm
up.
sorry.
I wanted to ask you, so many things I want to ask about Detroit, but I'll just ask this. We're often told that everybody's watching what's going to happen in Detroit, that,
They are.
Okay, but what are they watching? What could happen in Detroit that could be taken somewhere else? What part of the model do you think is the...
I mean, one of the ways is, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, nor does our center endorse this, but with the role of the federal government and what the federal government going to do or not do relative to recapitalizing a lot of these pension funds that are pension trusts that are used to pay the benefits that have been promised. I mean, that's one of the situations, like especially for a large city like Detroit, and if that's what ends up happening, which I don't know if it will or not. Who knows? How will that translate to other, especially large cities that are in a similar situation? But to actually relative to Detroit, just to give you an idea of where some of the other large cities are pension plan wise. Let's see here. DC Police and Fire in 2012 is 110% funded. Teachers the DC teachers is 94% funded. I can send this as well. I'm just looking at the big cities down this list here. Let's see. New York, St. Louis school employees is 80.9% funded. St. Paul teachers, 62% funded. And I'll send this list. These are the largest plans. I'm trying to see if they're. I know we have other city data, so I could share with you. Yeah.
So if ERISA is not the governing body, and I assume that the PCOAB is not the guarantor, is it state by state or?
Well, the theory is the guarantee comes from the sovereignty of the state to be able to tax.
So a lot of the coverage that I've seen, and I haven't done much on this, but a lot of the coverage that I've seen around state workers has some notion that, geez, they're really well paid, and how does the pension plan benefits of states track up against either private plans or against federal pension plans? Where can we go for comparative data? And also, I don't know if you have a thought or opinion or point to the whole question about whether or not state employees equivalent position are paid comparable to the private sector.
So if I could answer the second question first. When our center partnered with Michigan State, researchers from Michigan State, we looked at sort of comparison of position to position across multiple large states as far as how the different employees ranked when you account for both wage compensation and benefit compensation. And I think it's fair for me to describe it like this. If you were to break the workforce up into thirds, so like the more educated, highly paid individuals at the state level, when you account for compensation and benefits, make less than their counterparts in the private sector. Those that are in the middle third, so mid-management and thereabouts, those are at parity with their private sector counterparts, and those that are the lower wage, lower educated sector of the public sector makes more when you account for both relative to the private sector counterparts. And often, especially on the lower end, the reason that is because of the generosity of the pension benefit. So
it's a total compensation.
Total compensation, correct. And then also on your first point, while it's true, one thing I want to focus on with some of our research going forward is it's true. I'm not going to stand up here and say defined benefit pension plans are still the norm in the private sector, because we know they're not. But I think if you were to step back and you look at state government, and you say, listen, the majority of the folks that work for state government are knowledge workers. Over 50% have some form of higher education, and they're more or less not in a service industry. And you say, go match a large entity in the private sector that is a knowledge-based organization, that they have a high level of higher education and highly educated workforce. And you look at some of these, some of the Fortune 100 companies that fit that category. Many of them still maintain defined benefit pension plans. Now, I don't necessarily know if they will continue to offer them going forward, but you still have the situation where a lot of the similar recruitment retention, and then retirement benefits of the pension plan, the traditional pension plan, are offered for the same reasons that a state might be interested. You want to hold on to your lead engineer who knows the plans of your products longer, right? If you're in the private sector, so you want to incentivize them to stay. If you're in a larger consulting firm, you want to incentivize them to stay. So I'm not here saying defined benefit pension plans are thriving in the private sector. That's not what I'm saying. But oftentimes you need to make apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. Go ahead.
Yeah, changing pace a little bit. So North Carolina, the public pension has a return benchmark of 7.25%, which obviously is kind of hard to do in a low interest rate environment. So one thing the state treasurer has been really advocating for over the last few years is more statutory authority to invest in alternative investments, private equity, real estate. Is that something you're seeing at a lot of states, and does that threaten the soundness of a pension fund to have more money in those kind of investments?
So, broadly speaking, you're seeing increase in these plans in private equity
Mhm.
over the past 10 years. And actually, I just gave a presentation about that. I have some slides I'd be happy to send. But I don't think one could say that this more diversified portfolio always adds more risk, because folks will often argue that a diversified portfolio hedges against risk in a lot of ways. And so I think it's hard to make a generalization and say it's all of a sudden a more riskier portfolio. I think a lot of the conversation goes on in the state legislature. There are some states that very much restrict the types of investments that public trust can invest in. And that's not just for pension plans, it's also for some of these other governmental trusts that are used for the extraction of natural resources, where they set money aside and then pays for public. You think Alaska Permanent Fund, right? Or North Dakota, and two in Texas, right? And the state legislature, in one way or another, governs what the type of investments they can invest in, directly or indirectly. So, but I will send you that.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah, we have a nuclear decommissioning fund that's getting into alternative investments.
Yeah.
And for decades and decades, pensions could only be in bonds because they were viewed as liability driven. And there was a huge fight as to whether they could even go into equities. And when was that? Like the 70s or 80s?
It seems like the right time.
And now they're getting into currency trading, leveraged treasuries, hedge funds. But I sat through a presentation where they were talking about their value statement on a big pension board. And what one of the consultants said, which kind of floored me, was it is a bedrock moral principle of every pension defined benefit plan that they must have intergenerational equity. That is that the people who are paying in now and the workers who are getting it now should be equally treated across generations. So you shouldn't make a promise that the kids are going to have to pay, and you shouldn't have somebody fighting a fire right next to, and they're making 3% of every year's salary and retire at 50, next to a 25-year-old fighting the same fire who's getting 2% at 55. And I mean, from your yellow line that showed all the plans that are changing benefits for new workers, it appears that everybody is violating their own mission statements with a sense of abandon that I find interesting. I'm not sure what to do with that, but they all say that our goal is intergenerational equity, and our goal is to respect the liability side, to make sure the money's there when they retire. And yet you have almost nobody doing either, except for the handful of small states that appear to be really well managed.
Your point's well taken, and I think a really good comparative case study would be the airline industry in the early 80s, where you had a lot of change in how the employee was relating to the changes in the airline employer, and how you might have a stewardess, a flight attendant that was working, a flight attendant that had a defined benefit pension, working next to another flight attendant that was maybe making the same wage, but had a very much more narrower portfolio of benefits offered to he or she, and working next to one another. So we've seen this before, just in others.
I'm not sure the expectations there in the private market. I don't think people expect them to be fair.
In the last couple of minutes, we had a couple of hands up. Jennifer, did you still have a question?
No, I was going to say exactly what you wanted.
Okay, Tom, did you have something?
I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the unfilled positions. I know that was one of the questions, and it seems interesting as the economy gets stronger. Obviously, there are workers clamouring for every single job, and I know in Maine they're having difficulty recruiting state troopers because the salaries hasn't increased. There's a freeze on what you took away from that.
Well, if you're referring to the question in that survey, we've actually seen the list get longer.
Are these all? So this is all those positions?
Yeah. So
I thought that was the choice there.
No. These are all the positions. These are all the positions that human resource directors are saying they're having a hard time filling. And the list actually has increased throughout the recession. And in a
Doesn't
way,
leave many jobs that are filled.
well, in a way, it's a lot of those are going back to my knowledge worker comment. Given the fact that the majority of public workers are knowledge workers, they're your epidemiologists, they're your finance, your tech. There are no, there are not many service jobs because a lot of the service jobs that were in public sector have been contracted out for the most part, right? And so, I mean, you have, even right after the economic downturn, the unemployment rate for those with a college education or higher was still very low compared to those without. I forget what the numbers were, but so yes, even through the recession and as the recovery, states and localities continue to have a hard time recruiting more highly skilled workers.
You don't say law enforcement here.
Well, there's corrections.
Not state.
Yeah, I mean, we just went off of what the service respondents answered, and we sort of collected them together and looked to see what the more answered ones were.
What is a normal turnover rate for these kind of positions? Like, part of the conventional wisdom is government people stay longer, and in private industry there's a lot of turnover. Do you track turnover figures? Retention?
We don't, but I know Bureau of Labor Statistics in their JOLT survey, the job
openings.
Yeah. They offer that. But also to your point about sort of still having a hard time recruiting folks, this is now amongst the backdrop of reduced benefits and flat wages. So if anything, it's gotten harder for these states and localities to recruit the folks that they need, because it's amongst this backdrop that we've been talking about. So your point's very well taken. So,
Just to follow on Susan's question before too, when everyone's watching what happens in this story, aren't they also watching what the bankruptcy judges are going to do in terms of dismissing some of this stuff?
Yeah, I can't speak to that yet. It's a unique and groundbreaking situation all the way around.
I have a question. Is there a way to compare, is there a great website or somebody who compiles the benefits offered by different city and state governments at different levels? I'm envisioning a story where you would look at your town and compare what your firefighters make compared with other towns across the state. And particularly if the pension fund is in any kind of trouble, it seems like if you could sort of look at what other people were doing and
I hear you.
like, find out if your people were vastly overpaid compared with your neighbor 2 counties to the north.
I don't know of a national database, but I do know that several state municipal leagues, Florida, California, at least a few others, have done just that. They've done a survey.
North Carolina does too.
North Carolina, they will talk about the portfolio of how much wages and benefits are on.
Right. All right, well, thank you so much. This was terrific.